The very first nation on this planet to land a spacecraft on Mars was the Soviet Union, as of 1971, and what many people don't even know is that. A few weeks ago, NASA found declassified evidence of this landing that had been kept from the world public for a long time. What was the Soviets doing on Mars, and why didn't they talk about their discovery? These questions have massive answers and have stood unanswered for decades. No one realized that the Soviet Union had been the first nation on Earth to secretly direct and position the first lander on Mars. The rest of the world didn't really discover an incredible mission until decades later. Of all the Soviet Union missions, why did Mars 3 remain a secret to others? At that time, the USA had just captured the moon, and the country could have wiped them out. This question becomes easy to answer. Mars 3 reached Mars and landed, but sent data for only a short time. The probe failed, basically, just before it had gotten all the data for Mars. This was reason enough for the Soviet Union not to share the triumph they had hoped for, a sensational find. What if, in the 1970s, the Soviets had published images of settlement remains on Mars, or evidence of bacterial life for that matter? The Soviets wanted it, was just such a sensation. And they didn't care what report a probe sent back that got to Mars, but then stopped short. It would not allow the nation's pride. The Americans went on the moon, we cheered with the Americans. America's archenemy, the Soviet Union, just reported that it sent a more or less successful Mars probe. Such a report would have been completely lost in the news. The engineers worked secretly. New Mars probes bring new successes, pave the road to Russia's first filibuster on Mars. It would have been perfect if the triumph then. Mars 3. What did the probe discover? Soviet probe lands on surface of Mars, December 2nd, 1971. There was no USA on Mars, nor the ability to land its own probe there quite yet. But the Soviets remained silent amid a historic moment of the first landing of man-made object on Mars. Nobody knew it happened. With the landing, the signal from the lander stopped less than a few seconds later than the landing. It had been a mystery for a long time what the probe had found in the few seconds it had been active on Mars. But even when it was found out that the Soviets had landed on Mars, researchers and officials kept the readings to themselves. But when the Cold War closed and the Soviet Union collapsed, this changed. Even joint actions were the result of a pleasant rapprochement of East and West. Americans and Europeans now share the ISS with Russian astronauts. Back to the long secret measurement data and the very first image of the surface of Mars. And back to Mars 3 itself. The spacecraft measured the predominantly carbon dioxide atmosphere of Mars 3, and that, in combination with Mars 3, determined the surface pressure to be much lower than Earth's. A surface temperature of 110 degrees Celsius was recorded using onboard instruments. Despite its short operational time, the Mars 3 mission achieved something incredible, the first image ever recorded from the Martian surface. The image was grainy black and white, and the desolate landscape was clear. These first successes are hailed retrospectively today, but came as shock to Soviet Union. In secret, they had wanted to find better conditions on Mars so they could shine soon, with a spaceship that would take Russians to the planet. Finally, the nation thrashed by the moon successes of the USA could have vented at the cosmos. An ambitious program, that was just the tip of the iceberg, Mars 3 and 2 other missions. Liftoff on the first mission, Mars 1, in 1962, was intended to send data on the interplanetary region between Earth and Mars, fly by once around Mars, getting a feel for the surface. On March 21, 1963, radio contact was lost. A total power failure was later attributed to a malfunction on the device's orientation sensors. Mars 2 set out on its own journey on March 19, 1971. It reached its destination with a dual probe, a lander and orbiter. The descent module crashed on entry into the Martian atmosphere, but the orbiter collected data. Finally, great success was to come to Mars 1. However, it didn't bring the great success they hoped for. Fierce competition between East and West marked the 20th century. An era of unprecedented rivalry between the superpowers, between the United States and the Soviet Union. This competition served as a symbolic space race in which each kingdom tried to display its absolute technological and scientific superiority. Politically, militarily, and scientifically, there was constant competition between the US and the Soviets. The USA could never have matched the economic success of the Soviet Union. They had split politically after the Second World War, and militarily, the single largest arms race of all time had kicked in. The Soviets were determined to win the race, in space and in science against the US. The country pressed hard on with these actions, following the first artificial satellite, Sputnik, and the first manned spaceflight of Yuri Gagarin. It was met, of course, by the US's share of triumphs, among them the historic moon landings of the Apollo missions. The US, on the other hand, made its space missions media-friendly and transparent, but the Soviet Union did otherwise. The Venera missions to Venus were not shared with the public, and the Soviet Mars program remained until now secret. It's rumored today that the Soviet Venus missions were nothing more than a red herring. Nobody thought that the red communist and socialist nation had not so secretly put out feelers for Mars. It would have been such a triumph if Soviet spacemen had stuck a red flag in the red Mars dust. However, the communists were denied the triumph of having won the red planet for themselves. The two earlier reconnaissance probes were covered with Mars 3. Of course, the secrecy was not just of pride, it was of national security. Soviet Union chose to cloak their Mars setback in an era when any sign of failure was seen as a sensitive weakness. The Soviets presumably also feared spies from the West who might pick up sensitive data. Think of a US spy getting his hands on Soviet probe data, and then, of all things, seeing the value of some such data when the US decides to send its humans to Mars. The US had announced this goal first, the Moon, then Mars, but that's still more than 45 years later, and to date neither the US nor Russia nor the Soviet Union has sent humans to Mars. The more difficult part than expected. Both nations have suffered grievously through cycles of economic and social crisis. At the same time in the US, the poor and especially the African American community were railing against the astronomical cost of the Apollo missions and other space aspirations, whereas in the East, the whole of the Soviet state collapsed in the early 1990s. While NASA's overall budget increased again today, it is still small compared to pioneering days of the 1960s and 1970s. The successor nation to the Soviet Union also must deal with recurring shorter budgets, but Russia is also making headway again on the international space stage. The Venera probes, latest Soviet Mars missions and other such technology behind the Mars missions are now considered milestones in space exploration. One would think it would be difficult to name more engineers and scientists who overcame all these technological challenges, but it's admirable nonetheless, and needless to say, the Soviet Union would have succeeded sending probes to Mars had not resources and ambition stopped with the Venera project. Venera 13 sent the only images of inhospitable Venus. Probe after probe was sent off. Failure served to make the probes better and better. It would only have been a matter of time before the successes of the Mars probes. Their positions had Earth at different distances from Mars, ranging from 54.6 million kilometers to 401 million kilometers. The spacecraft had extremely precise navigation systems, such that Mars 1 and 3 had the ability to hit the mark. They were to communicate very smoothly with extreme power-based antennas and receivers. All Mars probes were envisioned to operate automatically, within some control system. The delay between Earth and Mars at that time was 22 minutes. Particularly innovative were the landers of both Mars 2 and 3 missions. Parachutes were used on the devices so that their descent speed could be reduced, and deceleration rockets were fitted so that a soft landing would be achieved. Exactly how NASA's first rovers landed many years later. The rugged nature of Mars's surface is unpredictable, and landers had to be made that could stand the impact and extreme temperatures. Without a doubt, the Soviet Union would have mastered this much sooner or later. After all, Venus is the hottest planet in the solar system, where it had sent probes that could somehow survive those conditions. Mars missions instruments were not simple. One of the cameras was a photo camera to view the surface of the Martian surface, and the other were spectrometers and other sensors to see what the Martian soil and atmosphere were made of. For all these reasons, then, Soviet Mars missions had to be considered impressive examples of technological innovation and engineering prowess, the future of Mars exploration in the 2020s. But Mars exploration is just starting a wonderful journey. In recent decades, the future has seen even greater discoveries as exploration of the red planet has picked up. The prospects are good for sending humans to a planet beyond Earth with renewed interest and advances in technology. Part of the renewed impetus to the now peaceful space race is due in no small part to the commitment of multi-billionaire Elon Musk. There are 5 nations with rovers and probes on Mars or around it right now. Every day we get new highlights from rover missions like Curiosity and Perseverance. The successor to the Soviet space agency Roscosmos is planning to team with the European Space Agency, ESA, on its ExoMars orbiter and a rover called the Rosalind Franklin to drive the rover into Mars. The two are looking for signs of life on the red planet. Political tension has put this on hold again. Again, Russia's political behavior isolates it, and it may miss the race to Mars. That said, don't forget to subscribe to our channel if you don't want to miss the next great top videos.